Inside a tense Supreme Court hearing, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts Chief Justices John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett over one of the most explosive allegations in judicial history: secret deals, hidden finances, and ethics violations at the highest level. Roberts and Barrett push back, calling her claims outrageous. But minutes later, Jasmine reveals recordings and financial transfers that no one in the room can deny. Just as the chamber erupts, FBI agents storm in with warrants in hand, leaving both justices stunned and speechless. If the guardians of justice are the ones rigging the system, is America already too late to save itself? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Supreme Court chamber had never felt more suffocating. Ornate ceilings loomed overhead like silent judges of their own, and the room, normally dominated by whispers of reverence, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Every seat was filled. Federal agents in dark suits stood along the back walls, arms crossed. Legal scholars from Yale and Georgetown whispered behind notepads, and from the press row, lenses pointed forward like loaded weapons. This wasn't a routine hearing. It was a constitutional rupture. A special session convened for a case so rare it bordered on the unthinkable. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing the United States House of Representatives, had come to formally accuse sitting members of the Supreme Court of grave ethical misconduct. The judiciary itself was on trial. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, a single figure wrapped in tension, dwarfed by the architecture, but radiating something sharper than fear: purpose. Above her, Chief Justice John Roberts sat perched like a monument, his expression unreadable beneath decades of polished restraint. Next to him, Justice Amy Coney Barrett leaned back in her chair, her eyes cool, her posture confident, arms folded in a silent dare. The weight of the room pressed inward, but Jasmine didn't bend. She stepped forward, her heels clicking once, twice, on the polished marble floor, then stopped. Her hands were empty, but her presence was armed. "If no one else has the courage to speak truth to power," she said, her voice unwavering, "then I will do it. Today, in this chamber, in front of every camera and every witness in this republic." A shift moved through the crowd. Barely a sound, just breath held and glances exchanged. Roberts's brow twitched, a flicker of disdain. Barrett smirked faintly as if watching a child try to lecture a parent. Jasmine knew that look. She'd seen it 1,000 times. Men and women in polished robes who mistook confidence for arrogance, defiance for recklessness. But what they didn't see was what the room now felt. She wasn't here to plead, she was here to confront. "I was not invited here to make polite conversation," she continued, her words slicing clean and sharp. "I was summoned by my oath to protect the Constitution from all threats, foreign and domestic, even those cloaked in authority." At the defense bench, a senior court clerk shifted uncomfortably. One of the journalists muttered, "She's not backing down." And she wasn't, because this wasn't just another hearing. It was a war of narratives. And Jasmine Crockett had just fired the first shot, with no intention of missing. And yet, just as Jasmine's voice had begun to echo in the bones of the room, the old guard moved to reclaim their ground. Not with evidence, but with derision. Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward slowly, as if preparing to deliver a verdict already written in his mind. His voice emerged cool and practiced, the voice of a man who had never been publicly questioned without consequence. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, tone deliberately measured, "this proceeding, let us be clear, is not about judicial ethics. It is about political theater." The words struck not like an argument, but like a verdict. "You're staging a spectacle," he continued, "under the pretense of constitutional duty. But the court is not your campaign stage, nor your personal battlefield." The impact was immediate. A few muffled snorts of amusement came from the back rows. Someone, likely a federal clerk, chuckled audibly before catching himself. Jasmine didn't blink. She had expected resistance. But the next voice came quicker and sharper. "Let's dispense with the performance," said Justice Amy Coney Barrett, cutting Jasmine off mid-sentence. "You have brought forward allegations that are at best speculative and at worst slanderous." She leaned back in her chair with deliberate confidence, crossing her arms. "What you're doing here," she said, "is not bravery. It's opportunism draped in indignation." Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but Barrett raised a single finger, silencing her without saying a word. "We've reviewed your submitted materials," Barrett went on, her voice taking on the cadence of a lecture. "They are riddled with conspiracy theories, half-formed narratives, and an astounding disregard for precedent. I'm not sure whether to treat them as a legal brief or fan fiction." The court chamber erupted in stifled laughter. A senior attorney from a prominent D.C. firm shook his head and scribbled something sarcastic into his legal pad. Across the aisle, a younger law clerk whispered to her neighbor, "She walked into a buzzsaw." Jasmine stood alone, stone still at the podium, but the silence around her wasn't respectful. It was calculated. Barrett glanced to Roberts with the satisfied smirk of a performer who knew the crowd was with her. "Frankly," she said, "this hearing demeans the very institution it claims to defend." And then with one last surgical line, "You're mistaking noise for evidence and outrage for law." It was the kind of dismissal that didn't just refute an argument, it erased it. Around the courtroom, tension thickened into suffocation. Jasmine was not just being opposed, she was being outnumbered, outtalked, and undermined by smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Every time she began a sentence, Barrett spoke louder. Every time she appealed to decorum, Roberts answered with condescension. This wasn't debate, it was ritual humiliation, wrapped in the robes of procedure. The gallery absorbed it all, some with discomfort, others with smug approval. And still Jasmine remained upright, though the weight pressing down on her was no longer just institutional, it was personal. A single question hung over the chamber like smoke clinging to old wood. How long could she stand, alone, before they silenced her completely? But humiliation only works if the subject believes it, and Jasmine Crockett did not. For 40 relentless minutes, she had been carved open, word by word, glance by glance, by the very institution sworn to serve justice. Interrupted, belittled, stripped of credibility in real time by robed titans cloaked in centuries of unchecked reverence. They had reduced her voice to background noise, her presence to political nuisance. And the courtroom, that sacred cathedral of law, had become a stage for coordinated erosion. Barrett's interruptions were no longer challenges. They were weapons. Roberts's cold authority was no longer neutral. It was strategic silence. Every paper shuffled by a clerk, every stifled chuckle from the rear bench, tightened the vice around Jasmine's presence. And so, after the 41st interruption, she did what no one expected. She said nothing. She simply stopped. Lowering her gaze, she gathered her documents slowly, methodically, like a soldier policing the field after a battle lost. Not a single paper was crumpled, not a single word revised. She wasn't retreating. She was remembering every time she'd been told to wait her turn, to speak less boldly, to survive systems not built for voices like hers. The courtroom watched with the smug anticipation of victory, assuming they had weathered her challenge. Roberts leaned back. Barrett exhaled through her nose, visibly pleased. Somewhere in the press box, a reporter began typing the opening line of an obituary. Crockett folds under fire. But then Jasmine did something that rewrote the oxygen in the room. Her fingers paused. Her head lifted. Not fast, not theatrical, but with a certainty that rewound the very arc of the morning. Her eyes, once burning with restrained defiance, now held something calmer and infinitely more dangerous. Resolve without mercy. From the inside lining of her blazer, she produced a small rectangular object. It gleamed under the chandelier's light. A silver USB drive, unmarked except for the weight it carried. She held it between two fingers, arm extended, the way one might offer a blade back to its owner. "If you won't believe me," she said, her voice low, steady, and so controlled it rang louder than any gavel, "then perhaps you'll believe yourselves." No reaction came, only silence. A different kind now, no longer dismissive, but bracing. Jasmine stepped away from the podium and approached the court's evidence terminal. Her movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as if invoking a final clause in a contract the court didn't know it had signed. A clerk instinctively stood, but Roberts gave no command. Barrett's eyes narrowed, but her mouth didn't move. Crockett inserted the drive. For a moment, the screen remained dark, ominously blank. Then it flickered. The seal of the United States appeared in stark grayscale on the massive monitor above the bench. The light from the screen cast a pale wash across the mahogany desks, the marble columns, and the stone-set faces of every justice present. It was no longer the courtroom that felt powerful. It was the screen, the drive, the truth waiting to be heard. Jasmine stepped back, her hands at her sides. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The chamber, once humming with contempt, now stood at the edge of something irreversible. The silence following the screen's activation was longer than expected, long enough for a few in the gallery to wonder if the file had failed to load. Then it began. The voice emerged, crisp and indisputable, from the embedded speakers that flanked the chamber like invisible sentinels. "Once that case clears the lower court," the voice said, clear, unhurried, chilling in its confidence, "we vote 6-3. Gorsuch won't resist it. Roberts wants it handled quietly. The rest will follow our lead." The speaker didn't identify herself. She didn't need to. The tone, the cadence, the rhythm between sentences. Everyone in that room knew that voice. It was Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The screen displayed an audio waveform alongside a timestamp. April 2nd, 9:27 a.m. The subject matter, the EPA's pending regulatory case, hadn't even been heard in oral arguments until the following month. And yet, here she was, calmly and clinically discussing the outcome, the vote count, the internal pressure points. She even gave a small laugh when someone off mic asked about donor reactions. A beat passed, then another line played. This case isn't about law. It's about how the decision is going to land politically. We can't afford a messy dissent. Keep the language clean. This one needs to send the right message to the right people. You could hear someone inhale sharply from the left wing of the gallery. One court officer stepped forward, then froze mid-step. Journalists stared at each other, eyes wide, pens motionless. Even the stenographer, trained to keep recording no matter what, hesitated long enough to miss a word. On the bench, Barrett had gone still, completely still, not blinking, not breathing, not moving. It was the kind of stillness that only happens when a mind races faster than a body can contain. Jasmine Crockett didn't move either. She stood beneath the screen, hands loosely clasped in front of her, expression unreadable. The overhead lights had dimmed automatically to give focus to the monitor, casting the courtroom into a half shadow that made it feel suddenly more like a tribunal than a court of law. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She let Barrett's voice do all the speaking, and the voice kept going. "We know how this one's going to play out. The filings don't matter, they're just for show. What really matters is consistency. If we hand the right side a clean win, they'll stick with us next cycle. Don't give the other side anything they can turn into a headline." It was that sentence, the last one, that broke the air. From the media pit, camera shutters fired like artillery. Someone in the second row whispered, "Jesus Christ." A reporter from The Atlantic scribbled a single word in their notebook, predetermined. At the far end of the courtroom, an older law professor from New York University turned to a colleague and muttered, "She just confessed to outcome engineering." Before anyone could process the full gravity of what they were hearing, the screen shifted. The left half remained occupied by the still rolling audio, but the right half now populated with a PDF, an official document stamped with the insignia of the Department of the Treasury and the DOJ. Jasmine moved for the first time, reaching toward the console and enlarging the page with 2 precise taps. There it was. The document detailed a financial transaction of $215,000, transferred from the Westland Foundation to a private investment trust under the control of Chief Justice John Roberts. The payment had been made on March 14th, just 3 days before Roberts issued a majority opinion that favored a pharmaceutical corporation in a high-stakes liability case. The memo attached to the transfer described it vaguely as an advisory consultation, with a note indicating the arrangement was non-public. No red flags had been raised at the time, But now in context, it felt radioactive. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't have to. The screen provided the rest. Below the memo line were transaction notes cross-referenced with a Treasury audit trail. The system had flagged the payment for unusual timing due to its proximity to the ruling, but no action had been taken until now. This wasn't an accusation. This was a documented event. Cold, verified, damning. The entire courtroom changed temperature. Justice Roberts' jaw tightened. He tried to look away from the screen but couldn't. Not because he was transfixed, but because to look away would be to admit guilt. Barrett still hadn't moved. She was no longer a figure of icy confidence. She looked like stone cracked by frost. One of the assistant clerks, maybe 25 years old, sat motionless with his hand frozen on the corner of his notepad. And then the murmurs began. Not loud at first, but desperate, barely contained whispers between legal scholars and agency officials. An NPR journalist mouthed the words "money trail" to her colleague. A former federal judge in the gallery leaned forward, visibly shaken. Even the justices seated at the far end of the bench, those not yet implicated, shifted in their seats, suddenly very aware of the weight of their silence. Cameras pivoted, lights flicked on. The media knew what this was now. This was history. This was scandal not wrapped in theory, but sewn into facts. Still standing beneath the screen, still surrounded by silence thick as courtroom oak, Jasmine Crockett finally turned to face the justices again. Her voice was low, not a shout, not a performance, but a blade that slid straight into the silence and split it clean. "Justice," she said, "cannot wear a robe just to sell the outcome." She stepped forward, one step, no more. It cannot drape itself in reverence while cashing checks behind closed doors. No one moved, because now no one dared pretend they hadn't heard. The air was no longer still. It was stretched so tight that the walls themselves seemed to listen. And then, like a thread finally snapping beneath tension, a new voice cut through the courtroom. From the third row, a woman stood. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't wait to be called. She simply rose slowly, deliberately, as if this exact moment had been rehearsed alone in 1,000 mirrors. She couldn't have been older than 30. Her features were sharp, almost severe, framed by the kind of stillness that suggested the storm had already passed inside her. A courtroom security officer moved instinctively, but Jasmine Crockett turned and raised a single hand, not to stop the woman, but to clear the path. The chamber, filled with murmurs only moments earlier, dropped into such silence it was possible to hear the echo of her heel as she stepped into the aisle. "My name," she said, her voice carrying not by volume but by clarity, "is Clara Miles." She paused not to gather strength, but to let the name settle, to make sure everyone, especially the ones on the bench, understood that this wasn't a stranger speaking. "I served as a personal aide and internal systems coordinator for Justice Amy Coney Barrett for nearly 4 years." She said it without shame, but each word landed like a tremor beneath Barrett's chair. Roberts turned slightly, eyes narrowing. Barrett remained still, but the shift in her posture was unmistakable. Her shoulders drew tighter. Her hand, resting on the polished desk in front of her, curled faintly. "I wasn't a policymaker," Clara continued. "I didn't write opinions. I didn't wear robes. I just kept things moving. Calendar updates, encrypted briefings, secure call records. Nothing glamorous, nothing headline-worthy. Until one morning in February, 2 months before the Frederick ruling, Justice Barrett asked me to access the internal server and delete the communication logs from the last 4 multi-chamber teleconferences." She stopped again, not to breathe, but to check the justices. Barrett hadn't flinched. Not yet. "I asked her if we were archiving the recordings first," Clara said, the words now measured like steps in a minefield. "She said no, that these weren't necessary to retain, that they were informal strategic discussions and should remain internal to prevent misinterpretation." Her voice didn't rise, but it grew heavier, like each sentence carried the weight of betrayal. "I'd never been told to delete raw judicial coordination data before. Not once. And I've never been asked since, by anyone else." In the back row, a legal historian began writing furiously. On the right flank, An official from the Judicial Ethics Office adjusted her glasses twice without looking down. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. The moment belonged to Clara and to the decision she had made when no one was looking. I was supposed to wipe the backups, delete the trace files, ensure the drive clusters were unrecoverable. A full zero right. Her voice finally cracked, just slightly at the edge. But I didn't. A gasp, small, involuntary, escaped from the gallery. I kept one, she said softly, not to hurt her, not to help anyone else, but because I knew, when I heard the way they spoke, that this wasn't about interpretation. It was about control. Her eyes drifted up to the bench now, no longer in fear, but in confrontation. It was about pre-deciding outcomes, about coordinating votes, about how to phrase concurrences so the media wouldn't notice the manipulation. And I couldn't erase that, because if I did, I wouldn't be an aide anymore. I'd be an accomplice. Barrett didn't move, but her stillness had changed. It was no longer regal, it was rigid. Clara took one final step into the open aisle, completely exposed. This isn't about party, she said. It's not about politics or even personal failings. It's about what happens when truth is sacrificed for convenience. And when silence becomes the only thing that keeps injustice alive. She turned slightly to face the audience. Not just the justices, the people. And I won't be silent anymore. No gavel fell, no objection was raised, no justice dared to speak. Because in that moment, Clara Miles wasn't just a witness. She was the reason the courtroom would never again be the same. The air hadn't moved in over a minute, but it felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Clara Miles' final words still lingered in the chamber, like smoke that refused to clear. No rebuttal came. No justice spoke. The room, once dripping with disdain, now sat hollowed and raw. And then, without fanfare, the reckoning stepped through the door. The rear entrance of the Supreme Court opened with the precision of an incision. No guards announced it. No bailiff banged a gavel. But the energy in the chamber shifted instantly, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm hits. A tall man crossed the threshold, moving like a blade drawn from its sheath. His face was unreadable. His suit was immaculate. And on his belt, the golden badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation glinted like a sealed verdict. He did not hesitate. He did not scan the room. His eyes went straight to the bench, straight to Roberts, straight to Barrett. And the courtroom, already rattled, held its breath again. He stopped at the base of the dais, unhurried, commanding, utterly still. When he spoke, his voice did not rise, but every person heard it like the crack of a bolt locking into place. My name is Special Agent Harlan Voss. I am here on behalf of the Department of Justice in the FBI Public Integrity Division. He paused only to draw a sealed plastic sleeve from a slim case at his side, its edges marked with federal insignia, its contents thick and unmistakably final. Under Judicial Order 24-3821, I am serving federal search and seizure warrants for the immediate confiscation of all personal and professional communication devices, including but not limited to mobile phones, laptops, tablets, and secure storage media, used or maintained by Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The sound that followed wasn't a gasp. It was silence, weaponized, a vacuum of disbelief. Justice Elena Kagan turned toward Roberts in open confusion. The lead clerk dropped his pen. It rolled unnoticed beneath the gallery railing. A cameraman in the press section lowered his lens, as if not believing what he was about to film. Roberts said nothing. Barrett didn't blink, but their stillness was no longer composed. It was defensive, shattered. The warrants, Agent Voss continued with lethal calm, are the result of a 14-month covert investigation authorized under joint oversight from the DOJ's Internal Corruption Division and a special federal judiciary review board. Authorization for electronic surveillance was obtained through FISA channels after repeated patterns of suspicious digital activity and confirmed whistleblower statements. He turned his body slightly, not away from the bench, but toward the record, toward the nation watching. The operation remained classified until corroboration crossed the statutory threshold under Title 18, Sections 201 and 371, regarding bribery of public officials and conspiracy to defraud the United States. Every phrase was a hammer driving deeper into the bedrock of the court. Justice Roberts' hand moved, just barely, just enough to shift one paper an inch forward on the bench. A meaningless motion. A man accustomed to control, now grasping for structure in a room that no longer belonged to him. Barrett's lips pressed tighter. Her fingers, once calm on the wood, now curled into her palm. But Agent Voss was not finished. He gestured without a word. 2 additional agents entered, one from each aisle, each carrying identical matte black evidence bags. Their faces were expressionless. Their movements were surgical. They advanced to opposite ends of the justices' table and laid the bags gently on the oak like surgeons preparing for extraction. No one resisted. No one dared. Because what they were watching was not politics. It was procedure. It was accountability, dressed not in rhetoric, but in chain of custody. And Jasmine Crockett, still standing in the soft glow beneath the evidence screen, watched with the calm of someone who had weathered fire to deliver this moment. Because now, for the first time in that chamber, it was power, not principle, that sat on trial. Even with federal agents now collecting personal devices and formal authority echoing through the chamber, the walls of the Supreme Court hadn't finished bleeding. Justice wasn't done speaking, not through witness or law, but through something colder and harder to deny: digital truth. The screen above the justices shifted again, this time without prompt. The seal of the DOJ vanished, replaced by a grainy digital interface that looked more like a cyber forensics dashboard than anything ever seen inside this chamber. Rows of text scrolled across the left side of the screen, indecipherable at first glance. Clusters of characters, fragmented sentence patterns, odd date stamps. Some in the gallery squinted, unsure what they were looking at. But then in the bottom corner, the screen flashed one word in stark crimson: decrypted. A soft voice came through the speaker system, not Jasmine's, not the FBI's, but the neutral tone of a Justice Department analyst. These records, the voice said, originated from a secure, non-governmental messaging channel linked to Chief Justice John Roberts' personal device. They were recovered following a 14-month surveillance operation authorized by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, targeting covert communication patterns connected to non-declared lobbying entities operating under pharmaceutical fronts. The entire room had turned to ice. The voice continued. The messaging platform was routed through 3 proxy servers, one of which was traced to the Mid-River Policy Forum, an organization registered as a nonprofit think tank, but financially backed by offshore contributions from multiple pharmaceutical conglomerates, including Westland Holdings, Helix Global, and Mirothera. Every name landed like a gavel against stone. Then the first decrypted message appeared in full across the screen. A plain white text bubble, black font, no timestamp, just content. We're holding 5 votes. Thomas is soft, but Barrett's locked. If you want liability coverage, push the brief edits by Friday. Tell Westland it's as close as I can get without raising red flags. The air left the room. This wasn't a policy conversation. This was a Supreme Court justice referencing case manipulation in direct coordination with an undisclosed private entity, before the case had even been decided. Barrett's name was used casually, as if part of a larger strategy. Thomas floated like a chess piece, and Westland, the same foundation that had been linked in financial disclosures earlier, mentioned not as an observer, but as a participant. The second message followed seconds later. The ruling will lean on interstate clause precedent. Kagan won't flip, but it's irrelevant. Draft opinion is with my assistant. Distribution will go through internal channel. No digital trail. That line landed like a blade. Draft opinion, no digital trail. Even the justices who had stayed quiet until now began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Justice Brown Jackson leaned slightly forward, eyes locked on the screen, expression unreadable, but frozen in alarm. A veteran journalist from the New York Times whispered a single word to the reporter beside her. Pre-ruling coordination. It was no longer an allegation. It was methodical. Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her expression remained unchanged, a portrait of devastating control. She had walked into this chamber as an outsider, branded political by those who had treated the court like their inheritance. Now the evidence was doing what her voice had been denied the space to do: speak with indisputable authority. This wasn't about conflict of interest anymore. This was about collusion, and the bench knew it. The chamber had turned into a crucible. The screen above them still glowed with the residual burn of exposed messages, and yet it was not enough for the court to yield. The system, like a wounded titan, reared up in resistance. Chief Justice John Roberts rose, the weight of his office pressing against his posture like armor, forged over decades. His voice was calm, but unnaturally so, like a rope pulled too tight. "This is a courtroom, not a circus," he said, staring down at Jasmine from the raised bench, eyes narrowed. "You do not speak for justice, you speak for vengeance, for spectacle. What you have done today is tear at the foundation of an institution you swore to uphold." He paused just long enough for the room to inhale. "You are not saving it, Congresswoman Crockett. You are destroying it." Jasmine did not blink. She stepped forward slowly, letting the silence stretch like a bowstring. Her reply did not rise, but it cut. "You mistake exposure for destruction, Chief Justice," she said. "You mistake honesty for heresy because you've spent too long in a place where no one speaks truth unless it flatters power." Her voice grew firmer, each word weighted like a gavel. "I didn't come here to tear down this court. I came to confront what's already rotting inside it. And that rot wears robes." The tension in the room turned physical. No one moved, no one breathed. Robert's lips tightened, but Jasmine had already turned back to the evidence console. Her hand hovered over the final command, her eyes fixed on the bench, not with anger but with sorrow. "You want to speak of foundations," she said, softer now. "Then let's speak of what's been built beneath them." With one tap, the final file loaded. The screen went black for a beat, then it flared to life, grainy but unmistakable. A private Zoom call, 3 faces, Roberts, Barrett, and a third man whose name tag read only M. Alders, Firm 42. There was no courtroom background, no neutral lighting, just private studies, blurred bookshelves, and the sterile blue glow of secrecy. The audio began. Roberts' voice, clear, calm, disturbingly casual. "We have an opportunity here to recalibrate constitutional interpretation for at least a generation, but it has to be gradual. We shift the center without announcing it." Then Barrett, her tone sharper, more direct. "The language needs to mask the movement. Traditionalist outcomes framed in procedural neutrality. That's how we stabilize long-term decisions, under the radar." And then Alders, the outsider, the financier, the one who didn't wear a robe but controlled those who did. "The donors backing this strategy expect continuity, predictable outcomes in line with originalist frameworks. If that's upheld, support will remain discreet and uninterrupted." The courtroom did not erupt. It collapsed inward. No outburst, no gavel, no denial. Just the heavy collective realization of betrayal spoken aloud in the justices' own voices. A justice system not only manipulated, but premeditated, curated, sold. Jasmine stood motionless beneath the screen, not vindicated, not victorious, but furious, in the quiet, sacred way only truth can summon. "You said I was tearing down the court," she said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with restrained fury. "But I'm not the one making deals in the dark. I'm not the one trading constitutional balance for ideological conquest." She stepped away from the podium and looked straight at Roberts. "Justice isn't yours to weaponize," she said, low and unwavering. "It belongs to the people who trusted you to wield it without bias. And today, they've heard what you've done with that trust." No one in the room spoke after that, because the court had not been challenged, it had been caught. The image on the screen still lingered, frozen in damning clarity. 3 faces, once symbols of impartiality, now rendered as architects of betrayal. The room, packed with the nation's most powerful legal minds, sat suspended in a silence so heavy it no longer felt like silence. It felt like judgment waiting to fall. Then came the shift. From the back of the room, a man in a dark, sharply tailored suit stepped forward. His pace was deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. His presence alone pulled every gaze. He carried no weapon, no badge visible on his chest. But in his hand, held tightly in a sealed folder embossed with the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice, was something far heavier: finality. He stopped just below the bench and unfolded the warrant with the slow precision of a surgeon. The leather strap snapped back, the seal cracked, and then his voice cut through the marble stillness with the force of a thunderclap. On behalf of the United States Department of Justice, and under the authority granted by a federal grand jury indictment reviewed and authorized by the Chief Inspector General for Judicial Conduct, he announced, I am executing arrest warrants for Chief Justice John Glover Roberts and Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The words didn't echo. They detonated. Every living thing in the chamber froze. A court officer dropped his pen. A reporter whispered an expletive before catching his breath. A clerk instinctively stood as if to protest, then slowly sat back down. No one moved beyond that, not from disbelief, but because movement felt suddenly forbidden, as though the entire nation's gaze had turned inward, and no one wanted to be the first to blink. The agent stepped forward next. Two shadows split from the light, dressed not for spectacle, but for certainty. Their suits were unmarked, their faces unreadable. One walked left toward Roberts, the other veered right toward Barrett. Their footfalls were soft, but in the silence they sounded like thunder. Roberts did not stand. His eyes narrowed slightly as if measuring the exact weight of the moment against his long career. The lectures given, the ceremonies attended, the rulings authored with surgical language and unquestioned authority. He looked not at the agent, but at the public gallery, as though searching for a familiar face who might call it all a misunderstanding. None came. The agent reached the steps to the bench and paused. Chief Justice Roberts, he said clearly, you are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, unlawful coordination with private interest groups, and violation of federal ethics statutes under Title 18. No resistance, no denial. Just a faint exhale from Roberts' nostrils as the agent gently but firmly placed a hand on his shoulder. Not aggressively, not theatrically, but as a symbol that even the highest seat in the judicial branch was no longer untouchable. Barrett remained seated too, her expression unreadable. Her hands, folded on the bench just minutes earlier, were now pressed flat against the table as if bracing for impact. Her lips moved slightly, forming a whisper no microphone caught. But her eyes never left Jasmine Crockett. There was no fear in them. Not yet, just disbelief. Like a chess player who'd stared too long at the middle of the board and never noticed the endgame collapsing at the edges. The second agent spoke. Justice Barrett, under the authority of a sealed federal indictment and pursuant to recommendations from the Office of the Inspector General, you are hereby placed under arrest. Charges include premeditated breach of judicial neutrality, conspiracy to tamper with procedural integrity, and abuse of position for ideological gain. He placed a hand on her shoulder with the same precision, the same quiet finality. Still, no one spoke. Not the other justices, not the legal analysts, not the press. Because at that moment, this wasn't a political development. This was a rupture in the myth of invincibility. The press gallery, armed with cameras, microphones, and keyboards, did not erupt into chaos. They documented, but silently. Some recorded, some scribbled. But most simply watched, stunned by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. These weren't rumors anymore. These weren't whispers in closed-door meetings or op-eds wrapped in ambiguity. This was history, turning in real time. For the first time in modern American memory, the highest judges in the land were no longer symbols. They were suspects. Behind the two justices, the great seal of the Supreme Court loomed on the wall, its embossed eagle still proud, its scroll still clutching the words, "Equal justice under law." But beneath it now stood two robed figures under federal arrest, and the contradiction screamed without sound. Even the architecture seemed to recoil, and through it all, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood alone. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. Her posture remained still, measured, resolute. She had not come to celebrate. She had come to reveal. The years she had spent being interrupted, discredited, called performative by those who wore their bias beneath velvet robes. This was not revenge. It was accountability, dressed in consequence. And yet even that triumph was not pure, because she had not just exposed corruption, she had exposed the fragility of an entire system that had for generations insisted on its moral superiority, insisted that it could police itself, correct itself, protect itself. But today the lie had collapsed, and no one, no conservative, no liberal, no clerk, no justice, could unsee what had just unfolded. The courtroom no longer belonged to Roberts, nor to Barrett, nor even to the institution they represented. It belonged for that moment to the truth. Not the sanitized version written into law school textbooks, but the kind that comes dripping in sacrifice, screaming in silence, and stepping into the light wearing a badge, holding a warrant, and calling time on the era of unchecked power. As the agents began guiding the justices from the bench, without cuffs but unmistakably under arrest, the entire room remained frozen, not because they didn't know what to do next, but because no one, in that storied chamber of marble and myth, had ever expected this day to come. And yet here it was, not a spectacle, not a partisan twist, but the moment the Republic turned the mirror on itself and didn't look away. The doors had not yet closed behind the agents when the silence in the chamber reshaped itself, not as absence of noise, but as the presence of reckoning. The spectacle had ended, but the meaning had just begun to settle. Some in the gallery still sat frozen, others held phones in trembling hands, broadcasting history in real time to a country that would awaken to a reality no longer theoretical. And in the center of it all, still beneath the Great Seal, still bathed in the stark white of the gallery lights, stood Jasmine Crockett. Not as a politician, not as an accuser, but as a woman who had just done what no one else had dared in 2 centuries of judicial tradition, held the robe to account. She didn't turn immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the bench where, just minutes earlier, the 2 most powerful judicial figures in the United States had sat like monarchs above reproach. Now their chairs stood empty, not by force, but by truth. And truth, for once, had not whispered. It had thundered. Jasmine slowly gathered the last of her documents from the podium, papers now unnecessary, their value eclipsed by what had already been revealed. She placed them carefully into a leather-bound folder, but there was no hurry in her movement. The storm had passed, the wreckage was visible, and all that remained was to name it. Then, with quiet certainty, she stepped away from the podium, heels echoing on the marble like punctuation marks. She stopped at the center of the chamber, no longer speaking from behind a microphone, but as one voice standing at the heart of a reawakened institution. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence around her carried her words like sacred air. "Today," she said, her voice resolute, "we did not lose the Supreme Court." A pause followed, long enough for the weight to land, for every ear in the room to lean forward. "We reclaimed it, from those who turned it into their private instrument, from those who cloaked corruption in tradition and called it continuity, from those who forgot that justice is not loyalty to an ideology, but to the people." She let the words linger. There were no cameras clicking now, no papers rustling, only breath, and what truth feels like when it finally breaks through the walls. Jasmine glanced once at the gallery, at the young interns in suits too large for them, at the law students whose hands had stopped taking notes, at the journalists who had come seeking drama and found history. Then she looked up, past the empty chairs, past the flag, toward the inscription carved above the bench. Equal justice under law. And for the first time all day, she allowed herself a faint, weary smile, not of triumph, but of survival. "This institution belongs to the people," she said finally, her tone softer now, but no less commanding. And today it answered to them, not just in name, but in consequence. She stepped away from the center. No applause followed, no shouting, no spontaneous eruption, because what she had done was not performative. It was surgical. It was the removal of rot from a sacred body, painful, precise, and irreversible. As she walked toward the great doors, her figure shrinking slowly beneath the towering marble columns, some of those in the gallery stood. Not because they were instructed to, but because instinctively they knew they were witnessing a transfer of something elemental: ownership, truth, responsibility, a restoration. She didn't turn around, because the work was never in the turning, it was in the facing forward. The doors closed behind Jasmine Crockett, but their echo did not fade. It ricocheted across the nation like a crack in glass that refused to stop spreading. By nightfall, the footage had been replayed on every major network, dissected in frame-by-frame analysis. Social media flooded with 1,000 interpretations, 20 million shares, and hashtags that broke every trending algorithm. For the first time in modern memory, the American people had not merely witnessed political theater. They had watched a reckoning, not behind closed doors, not buried in obscure legal language, but live, public, irreversible. And it didn't stop there. The morning after the hearing, a stunned Congress convened an emergency session. The images from the courtroom, federal agents laying hands on robed justices, encrypted messages blinking on courtroom screens, Clara Miles's trembling testimony, had become more than news. They were now a constitutional alarm bell, one that no senator, regardless of party, could afford to ignore. Proposals that had languished for years, dusty, symbolic drafts calling for judicial ethics oversight, were dusted off, rewritten, and pushed into debate within 24 hours. But the air in Washington had changed. This wasn't negotiation. It was survival. No one wanted to be the next official caught ignoring the rot that had just been ripped into daylight. Senator Mark Langdon of Massachusetts stood on the Senate floor, voice heavy with history. If the highest court in our land can be used as a weapon against democracy, then democracy must have the courage to disarm it, ethically, lawfully, permanently. The Judiciary Accountability and Transparency Act, once dismissed as impossible, passed its first procedural vote by an unprecedented margin, 92-8. Within days, both chambers had begun reshaping it into binding policy. For the first time in U.S. history, Supreme Court justices would be bound to a codified code of conduct, subject to independent review panels, mandatory financial disclosures, and, most shockingly, public hearings if accusations of misconduct surfaced. But even as reforms surged forward, the country itself split along a deepening fault line. In some corners of America, there was outrage, not at the corruption, but at the exposure. Conservative commentators called it a coup cloaked in righteousness. "This is mob justice, plain and simple," one radio host barked into the microphone. "It's not about ethics, it's about ideological extermination." Others went further, claiming the hearing was orchestrated to delegitimize the court and usher in judicial socialism. Protests erupted outside the Supreme Court gates, some waving flags, others brandishing signs that read, "Roberts was framed," and "Save Barrett, save the Constitution." But for every angry chant, there were thousands of quiet, tremulous sighs of relief. Not because the corruption had been corrected overnight, but because someone had finally dared to name it. In cafes and classrooms and law firms and living rooms, Americans who had long whispered doubts about the integrity of their justice system now spoke them aloud, without shame. A mother in Michigan told a news crew, "I've tried for years to teach my son that justice matters, that the courts are sacred. Yesterday, I finally felt I wasn't lying." In Philadelphia, a former public defender tweeted, "I've lost too many cases I should have won, not because of facts, but because the system wasn't blind. It was bought." Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy the court. She cracked open the lie that it couldn't be touched. Opinion polls, released just 72 hours after the arrests, reflected a paradox. Trust in the court's current makeup had plummeted to a historic low, just 18%. But belief that the system could be repaired surged to 67%. Because while the arrests shattered illusions, they had also done something rare in the American psyche. They introduced accountability into a place once thought immune to it, and Jasmine Crockett, whether celebrated or vilified, became the face of that shift. Late-night hosts praised her composure, her words replayed like war cries for a democracy that had been gasping. A viral montage spread of her final line. "We did not lose the court, we reclaimed it," overlaid with archival footage of civil rights marches and protesters demanding equality outside federal buildings. It wasn't just political content, it had become cultural therapy, but the backlash was real. Threats poured in. Security around Jasmine's home was increased. Her staff fielded over 400 hate messages in 2 days. Some accused her of trying to overthrow the judiciary. Others called her a traitor. But through it all, she didn't flinch. She gave no interviews, made no appearances. When asked by a journalist if she had anything to say to the country, she replied, "Justice doesn't need commentary, it needs consequences." In private, however, she remained alert. She knew that exposure alone wasn't justice. That power has a way of regrouping, of rebranding itself in silence, waiting for public outrage to tire. She'd opened a door. Now it would take generations to walk through it. But something had shifted that could not be undone. At Columbia Law School, a third-year student stood in front of a packed seminar and said, "For the first time in my education, I believe judicial ethics isn't just theory, it's survival." In Washington, D.C., the marble steps of the court, once seen as untouchable, had become a place of reflection. Tourists stopped not just to take photos, but to ask questions. How long had it been going on? Who else knew? Could it happen again? And in a small town in Georgia, a high school civics teacher played the entire hearing for her class. She didn't give a lecture. She simply asked, "What do you think justice looks like now?" No one had a simple answer, but none of them laughed, because now they knew what justice didn't look like. It didn't look like robes immune from scrutiny, or decisions shaped in the shadows, or financial ties masked as legal reasoning. It looked like a chamber full of tension, a voice willing to rise, a truth that, once spoken, didn't fade, and a nation, bruised and bewildered, daring to believe that perhaps justice, finally, was learning to stand on its own again. But as the headlines began to blur and the shock waves rippled outward, through Congress, through classrooms, through the long corridors of public opinion, there was a deeper question rising beneath the roar. What was the cost of speaking truth to power? And who carries that cost when the cameras go dark? Because this story, despite all its grandeur and historic consequence, was never just about institutions. It was about people, about what it takes for one human being to stand in a room full of untouchables and say, without shaking, enough. It was about Jasmine Crockett, yes, but it was also about every whistleblower who went ignored, every public servant who stayed silent because they were afraid, every voice that had been taught that justice was someone else's responsibility. That illusion had been shattered now, and in its place, amid the rubble of marble decorum and mythic authority, stood something far more fragile and far more real: conscience. Jasmine Crockett had not grown up expecting to fight Supreme Court justices. She had not trained for a televised war against the most insulated power in America. She had known hunger. She had known shame. She had known the pain of being told to sit down by people who had never once stood for her. And yet, when the moment came, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, she stood anyway. That is the human lesson. That courage is not the absence of fear. It is what survives after fear has done its worst. She had been mocked, interrupted, laughed at, called delusional, called dangerous. Justice Barrett had smirked at her. Justice Roberts had dismissed her. And the room, full of smug clerks and silent colleagues, had watched, waiting for her to collapse beneath the weight of doubt. But she didn't collapse. She endured. And that endurance, that refusal to be broken even when she stood alone, is not just political, it is personal. It is the quiet fire every person carries in some corner of their soul. The part of them that remembers what fairness felt like before it was stolen, what honesty sounded like before it was filtered through spin, what truth looked like before someone rich or robed told them to forget it. In that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend democracy, she defended memory. She reminded a country drowning in noise that integrity still matters, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's dangerous. Because power is never humbled by permission. It is humbled by resistance, and resistance is always born from conscience. The arrest of 2 justices didn't redeem the system overnight. It didn't undo decades of bias or balance a scale that had long been tipped by wealth and access. But it gave something far more vital than resolution. It gave evidence. Evidence that justice could bleed, but still stand. That a system, no matter how rigged, could still be forced to confront itself. That truth, when spoken clearly and without apology, can pierce even the thickest armor of tradition. But perhaps the most human lesson of all was this. Jasmine didn't walk out of that hearing as a hero. She walked out exhausted. Not because she was weak, but because real courage takes something from you. It is not glamorous. It is not victorious. It is the kind of courage that leaves you wondering, late at night, if it was worth it. She would carry that doubt for the rest of her life, but she would also carry something else. The knowledge that for one sacred moment in history, when the lie threatened to become law, she chose to confront it. Not with vengeance, not with malice, but with the quiet, terrible force of truth. And that truth now belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, to every intern who filed a report no one read, to every woman told she was too emotional, to every working parent who thought the system was never meant for them, to every voter who thought their voice was too small to matter. Because Jasmine's voice had once been small too, and she had used it anyway. This is not just a story about justice. It is a story about what it means to keep going when justice seems impossible. About the grit it takes to call out betrayal inside a building designed to silence you. About the terrifying beauty of standing alone, until suddenly you're not. Because when she stood at that podium and said, "We reclaimed it," she wasn't just talking about a court. She was talking about belief in the idea that power is not sacred unless it is accountable, that institutions are not holy unless they serve the people, that democracy is not self-sustaining, it is defended every day by people who bleed, who stumble, who get up anyway. And in that, the story of Jasmine Crockett becomes more than political theater. It becomes instruction, that the soul of a nation isn't written in marble. It is written in the choices we make when the stakes are highest, when no one is watching, or worse, when everyone is. She did not save the system. She reminded it of what it was meant to be. And that reminder, as fragile and fleeting as it may feel, is how democracies endure. Not because they are perfect, but because sometimes someone steps into the fire not to burn it all down, but to light the way out. But the most dangerous silence is the one that follows truth. The hearing had ended. The arrests had been made. The headlines had burned through every screen in America. Yet in the quiet that followed, a darker question lingered, one that Jasmine Crockett herself understood better than most. Will anyone do anything with what they've seen? Because history has never been changed by exposure alone. It is changed by engagement. Exposure is the lightning flash. Engagement is the fire that must follow. And without fire, the storm passes. The system resets. The rot seals itself back in. Jasmine had lit the fuse. Yes, but that was never going to be enough. Not unless someone was willing to carry the flame. This is that moment, and it does not belong to her anymore. It belongs to everyone else. It belongs to the voter who's grown tired of cynicism, but doesn't believe their ballot matters. To the teacher who skips the chapter on judicial ethics because it's too complex. To the worker who pays taxes into a system that protects power, but rarely defends the powerless. To every parent, student, veteran, and neighbor who watched the collapse of moral authority unfold and thought, what now? This is what now. This is the turning point between spectacle and legacy. Jasmine did not fight to become the story. She fought to start one. And stories like these, ones that matter, ones that risk everything, only survive if others continue writing the next chapter. So what comes next is not a question for Congress. It's a question for you. What will you do with the truth? Will you let it settle into another cautionary tale, filed away behind scandal and statistics? Or will you turn it into action? Because make no mistake, corruption does not fear the spotlight. It fears the aftermath. It fears the citizen who doesn't move on, the community that doesn't forget, the country that doesn't forgive without accountability. That is the only force powerful enough to make justice more than a word, a force that no robe, no title, no legacy can stand against, a public that finally decides to care. Jasmine Crockett stood alone at that podium, not because others lacked passion, but because too many lacked permission. You have that permission now. You don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need a seat in Congress. You don't need to know case law or court precedent. You just need to believe that justice is worth defending, that silence is not neutrality, that indifference is not safety, and that every institution, no matter how sacred, is only as righteous as the pressure we place upon it to remain so. So let the aftermath begin with questions. Why did it take this long? How many rulings were compromised? How many voices were crushed in silence? Who benefits from our forgetting? And who suffers when we pretend this didn't happen? Because pretending is how injustice survives. It does not scream, it whispers, it wears robes and speaks Latin, it smiles behind tradition and shakes hands at luncheons. It counts on your exhaustion, it feeds on your doubt, and it survives because good people assume someone else will fight it. Don't. Don't assume someone else will hold the line. Don't assume another Jasmine is waiting in the wings. There might not be. There might only be you, your voice, your demand, your refusal. The path forward will not be comfortable. It will not be quick. Real change never is, but it will be real, and that is more than most generations are given. You have seen something rare, an unmasking of the very institution designed to interpret the soul of the Constitution. You cannot unsee it. So don't try. Don't retreat. Don't recycle this as another moment in a never-ending scroll of outrage. Let it be the place where something stopped, and something else, something harder, something braver began. Call your representatives. Demand an independent ethics tribunal for all federal judges. Support whistleblowers. Fund civic education. Challenge narratives that normalize injustice. Share this story until it reaches the ones who pretend not to hear. Until the price of complicity becomes too high for even the powerful to afford. Because Jasmine didn't take on giants so we could return to sleep. She did it so we would wake up. And now that we're awake, we have only two options. Look away or step forward. And if we step forward, not with rage but with resolve, not with chaos but with clarity, then maybe, just maybe, we will look back on this day not as the collapse of something sacred, but the moment we finally made it sacred again. And if you're still asking whether one voice matters, remember hers. She was called dramatic. She was labeled reckless. She was dismissed as emotional. They tried to drown her in process, procedure, and polished contempt. But when the country turned its eyes to the bench that day, it was her voice they heard. Not because she was loud, but because she was right. And that is the legacy power fears most. Not rebellion, but reason. Not noise, but clarity. Jasmine Crockett stood not as a symbol, but as a standard. A reminder that truth does not need a majority to be true. It only needs to be said, clearly, fiercely, and without apology. That's what you must carry now. Because the war for justice was never meant to be won in a single hearing. It's waged every day in quiet places. When a citizen files a request, no one expects them to. When a young woman refuses to stay silent about what she saw in a judge's office. When a retired postal worker gathers signatures, not for fame, but because no one else will. These are not grand gestures. They are tectonic shifts. They are how the system bends, slowly, painfully, but inevitably, back toward fairness. And don't let anyone tell you that fight is naive. What's naive is believing corruption fixes itself. What's naive is assuming integrity will survive if it's never demanded. What's naive is thinking power ever gives back what it takes without being forced to. No, hope is not naive. Hope is brutal. It requires you to look directly at everything broken and still choose to build. That is what Jasmine did, not because she was unafraid, but because she was unwilling to live in a country where fear kept everyone quiet. So let this be the last silence you accept. Let it be the final time you tell yourself you're too small, too late, too far removed. You are not. You are standing in the exact moment history is shaped by the accumulation of ordinary people who refuse to be dismissed, who refuse to let cynicism become policy, who believe against all odds that the arc only bends if someone pulls it. You are that someone, so pull, speak, act. Because if Roberts and Barrett taught us anything, it's that unchecked power is not just dangerous, it's designed to convince you that there's nothing you can do. Jasmine Crockett proved otherwise. Now it's your turn. Don't wait for another fire to ignite the room. Be the spark. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.